The Stradivarius Violin Strangling, narrated by Connor from Velvet Clues. Welcome, my friends, and thank you for joining me this evening on Velvet Clues. Before we venture into tonight's particular mystery, I have a question for you. Have you ever considered what it might feel like to have everything you've worked for collapse in a single, devastating moment? How that loss might transform a person? How it might drive them to darkness? Hold that thought as we settle in with our detective, Miss Jane Marple, for a story of art, deception, and revenge. I'm Connor, and I'll be guiding you through this tale of the Stradivarius Violin Strangling. Let us begin. Chapter 1. The Silent Melody of Greed. The autumn rain fell upon London's Chelsea district, with the persistence of an unwelcome suitor, drumming against the tall Georgian windows of Ashworth and Associates, with the rhythmic insistence that seemed to mock the silence within. Miss Jane Marple, having spent the morning attending to correspondence at her small flat near Knightsbridge, found herself walking along King's Road in search of a particular bookshop when she witnessed the small crowd beginning to gather outside the establishment. The shop itself was elegant and discreet, its window displaying a single violin upon a bed of deep velvet, and it bore the kind of understated prestige that suggested prices rather beyond the reach of ordinary music enthusiasts. A police constable stood at the entrance, his notebook already in hand, his face bearing the particular expression of someone who had encountered something considerably beyond the usual range of minor disturbances. Miss Marple paused to adjust her umbrella, observing with the gentle curiosity that had served her so well through decades of life in the English countryside. The constable noticed her attention and moved as though to redirect the elderly woman away from the scene. But it was then that Inspector Harold Carmichael emerged from the shop, his lean face carrying the weight of unwelcome discovery. "Inspector," Miss Marple said gently, "I do hope nothing too dreadful has occurred." The inspector's expression shifted slightly upon recognizing her. "Miss Marple," he said with evident relief, "perhaps your presence here is fortuitous rather than merely coincidental. We have a death, I'm afraid, and the circumstances are rather more unusual than I might wish." He gestured toward the shop's interior. "The victim is Mr. Stephen Ashworth, proprietor of this establishment for some 23 years. Found this morning by his assistant, Mr. James Weatherby, at approximately 8 o'clock. "I see," Miss Marple replied, moving with careful deliberation toward the shop's interior. "And the nature of his death suggests something beyond the ordinary?" It was Inspector Carmichael's turn to hesitate. "He was strangled, Miss Marple," the inspector said, lowering his voice. "Strangled with what appears to be violin strings." "Violin strings?" she inquired, her keen eyes taking in the details of the shop as she stepped across the threshold. "The window display violin, perhaps?" "Not precisely," Inspector Carmichael replied, leading her toward the back room where a man of approximately 40 lay upon a Turkish carpet, his face discoloured and distorted by the violence that had ended his life. The murder weapon, if one could call it such, was a set of E-strings, finest quality by all accounts, still wound about his neck with sufficient force to have caused death in what the physician estimates to be a matter of minutes. The peculiarity lies in their origin. The strings bore the maker's mark of the legendary Stradivarius workshop, a designation that is impossible, as no such strings have been manufactured in nearly 3 centuries. Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe the body without interfering with the inspector's investigation. She noted the arrangement of Ashworth's body, the way his hands had clawed at the improvised garrote, and the expression of shock and betrayal that death had frozen upon his features. She observed, too, the disorder of the office, drawers pulled open as though in desperate search, papers scattered across the floor, and a wall safe standing conspicuously empty. "Someone was searching for something," Miss Marple murmured, her eyes moving from the chaos to the peculiar instrument of death. "The strings themselves, Inspector, tell me about their quality." "They're exceptional," Carmichael said, producing a small evidence bag containing a fragment of the murder weapon. "The craftsmanship is superlative, which is precisely why their origin troubles me so greatly. If they are genuine Stradivarius strings, they would be worth a considerable sum, yet they were used as a murder weapon by someone who seems to have cared nothing for their monetary value. That suggests," Miss Marple observed gently, "that the strings held a significance beyond their market worth. Perhaps they represented something more personal?" The inspector's keen eyes sharpened. "You've not yet examined the scene for 5 minutes, and yet you've already identified what may be the crucial element of this mystery. I confess I'm impressed and slightly humbled." "It is merely a matter of observation," Miss Marple replied, with characteristic modesty. "I have lived many years observing human nature in all its manifestations. Greed and revenge often leave distinctive fingerprints upon the crimes they inspire. I wonder, Inspector, whether you might tell me something of Mr. Ashworth's business and his associates." Inspector Carmichael conducted Miss Marple through the shop, explaining as they walked the particulars of Ashworth's establishment. The man had been a violin dealer of considerable reputation, specializing in instruments of exceptional quality and authenticity. His client list included concert violinists, orchestral musicians, and private collectors from across Europe and beyond. His reputation for guaranteeing authenticity was said to be impeccable, and his valuations were accepted without question by insurance companies, auction houses, and major institutions. A position of considerable trust, Miss Marple observed, which might explain why someone would regard him as worthy of such violence. Did Mr. Ashworth maintain such trust with consistency, or might there have been occasions when his reputation came under scrutiny? The inspector frowned thoughtfully. "There was an incident approximately 3 years ago," he said slowly. "A concert violinist named Isabel Marchant acquired what Ashworth guaranteed to be a genuine Stradivarius. The instrument was valued at nearly £2 million. The woman performed throughout Europe with considerable acclaim. Her career appeared to be ascending toward the highest echelons of classical music. And then," Miss Marple prompted gently. "Disaster," Inspector Carmichael said grimly. "During a live performance at the Royal Albert Hall before an audience of 3,000 people, a guest musician examined the violin during an intermission. He recognized immediately that the instrument was a forgery, an extremely skilled forgery, but a forgery nonetheless. The discovery became public within hours. Marchant's career effectively ended overnight. Concert halls cancelled her performances, orchestras withdrew their invitations, and the entire musical establishment turned away from her as though she carried a contagion. A most devastating consequence," Miss Marple observed. "And what became of this unfortunate woman?" "She disappeared from public life entirely," Carmichael said. "Withdrew from London, ceased her professional activities. As far as my records indicate, she has not been seen in society for approximately 2 years. Her last known residence was a cottage near Ashford in Kent, though there is no guarantee she remains there." Miss Marple's eyes had taken on that particular gleam that Inspector Carmichael had come to recognise as the moment when her seemingly casual observations began to coalesce into meaningful patterns. "I should very much like to examine Mr. Ashworth's client records," she said, "and if possible, I would appreciate the opportunity to speak with his assistant, Mr. Weatherby." The assistant proved to be a nervous young man of perhaps 26 years, with the uncertain demeanour of someone recently thrust into circumstances considerably beyond his normal experience. He sat in the shop's small sitting room, clutching a cup of tea with trembling hands, his eyes red from weeping. "Mr. Weatherby," Miss Marple began with characteristic gentleness, "I understand you discovered Mr. Ashworth this morning. Can you describe for me the events of the morning with as much detail as you can recall?" Weatherby drew a shuddering breath. "I arrived at approximately 7:45, he said hesitantly. "My usual time. The shop door was locked, which was normal, but when I entered using my own key, I sensed immediately that something was amiss. The backroom light was on, and there was a strange silence about the place, as though the very air had been emptied of its usual vitality. Did you notice anything unusual about the shop itself? Anything out of place or disturbed?" "The drawers in the office were open," Weatherby said, his voice becoming steadier as he focused on concrete details. "And there was a sort of disorder that Mr. Ashworth would never have permitted. He was a man who maintained meticulous standards, everything in its proper place. When I found him, I thought at first that he might still be alive, that perhaps he had simply been rendered unconscious. But then I understood that he was gone, that the strings around his neck meant that someone had deliberately taken his life." "The strings themselves, Mr. Weatherby, did you recognize them as being of particular significance?" He shook his head uncertainly. "They appeared to be of exceptional quality, but Mr. Ashworth handled instruments and strings of the finest calibre on a daily basis. I'm afraid I cannot speak to any unique characteristics. Miss Marple settled back in her chair, her mind already beginning to construct the framework of the mystery. Tell me, has Mr. Ashworth had any unusual visitors in recent weeks? Any inquiries that seemed extraordinary or troubling? Weatherby considered the question carefully. There was one woman, he said finally. She came perhaps a month ago, examined several of our instruments with considerable knowledge. Mr. Ashworth seemed both pleased and unsettled by her presence. They spent several hours in conversation, though I could not hear the substance of their discussion from where I worked in the front. And did this woman provide her name or any indication of her purpose? She said her name was Miss Bennet, Weatherby replied, and she seemed particularly interested in our Stradivarius instruments. Mr. Ashworth showed her several, though he noted that most of our finest pieces were available only to established clients through private arrangement. Miss Marple rose from her chair with the careful deliberation of one accustomed to navigating the complications of aging joints. I think, Inspector, that we shall need to locate Miss Bennet, or perhaps I should say Miss Marchant. I have a strong suspicion that the answer to this mystery lies not in the mind of a stranger, but in the heart of someone whose suffering has transformed into something far darker than grief. Chapter 2. The Gallery of Accusations. The morning light had strengthened considerably by the time Miss Marple and Inspector Carmichael made their way to the small gallery in Bloomsbury where, according to their inquiries, Isabel Marchant had been employed for the past 18 months under an assumed name. The gallery, called the Aurelia Collection, specialized in artworks and artifacts related to musical instruments, and its proprietor, a woman of uncertain age named Vivian Caudle, received them with the wariness of someone expecting complications rather than pleasant conversation. "We are seeking information regarding one of your employees," Inspector Carmichael began, producing his identification. "A woman who may be known as Miss Bennet, or whose true identity may be Isabel Marchant." Vivian's expression shifted immediately from wariness to something resembling fear. "Miss Bennet left my employ 3 days ago," she said quickly, abruptly, and without providing proper notice. "If she is engaged in some impropriety, I assure you I knew nothing of it." 3 days would place her departure approximately 1 day after Mr. Stephen Ashworth's death, Miss Marple observed gently. "That timing strikes me as rather significant. Tell us, if you please, what sort of work Miss Bennet performed in your gallery." Vivienne gestured toward the walls, which displayed a magnificent array of instruments, paintings of famous violinists, historical documents, and photographs spanning several centuries of musical history. She was primarily engaged in cataloguing and authentication work. The woman possessed an extensive knowledge of musical instruments, particularly violins. She could identify the maker of a Stradivarius merely by examining the instrument's finish and construction. It was that very skill that made her so valuable to my establishment. "And did she ever mention to you her own background, her own history with music?" Miss Marple inquired. "Not in so many words," Vivian replied, "but occasionally I would hear her playing late in the evening when she thought no one remained in the gallery. She would perform on a rather old violin that she kept with her possessions. The music was beautiful, desperately beautiful, but also infused with such melancholy that it was painful to hear." Miss Marple and Inspector Carmichael exchanged a meaningful glance. "And this violin, did Miss Bennet ever mention its origin or its maker?" "Once," Vivian said hesitantly. "I asked her if perhaps it was a valuable instrument. She laughed, though there was no humour in the sound. She said it was the one honest thing in her possession, made by a competent craftsman from Prague in the 1940s, worth perhaps £3,000, and that its very lack of pretension made it infinitely more valuable than any forgery." "Forgery," Miss Marple repeated softly. "That word suggests a particular knowledge of deception in violin manufacture. Might Miss Bennet have discussed with you the subject of forged instruments?" Vivian hesitated, then seemed to arrive at a decision. "She mentioned it once," she said slowly. "We were discussing a particularly beautiful Stradivarius that had come to the gallery for authentication. I expressed admiration for the instrument. She became quite agitated, saying that beauty alone was not sufficient evidence of authenticity, that the most convincing forgeries were often the most beautiful, precisely because they had been created by craftsmen of genuine skill. Did she ever mention Stephen Ashworth by name? Yes, Vivian said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Once. She said that some dealers valued profit above honour, that some men would sell fragments of the past itself if it meant enriching their own coffers. I assumed she was speaking philosophically, but now I wonder. Miss Marple turned from the gallery walls to face Vivian directly. I believe, Miss Cordell, that Isabel Marchant came to work in your gallery with a specific purpose in mind. She was seeking to understand the mechanisms by which forged instruments were created and sold. She was gathering knowledge that would later serve a darker purpose. I wonder whether you might provide us with the address where she was residing during her employment here. A short time later, having obtained Miss Marchant's last known residence, a modest flat in Clerkenwell, Miss Marple and Inspector Carmichael proceeded to the location with considerable anticipation. The landlady, a woman of approximately 70 named Mrs. Helen Underwood, provided access to the flat with the reluctance of someone who sensed that cooperation with police inquiries rarely concluded without complications. The flat itself was sparse and meticulously arranged, with barely a personal possession visible beyond the necessities of daily life. The violin that Vivian had mentioned rested upon a simple wooden stand near the room's only window. A journal lay upon the small desk, its pages filled with notes and sketches related to violin construction, wood grain patterns, varnish techniques, and an extensive study of the distinguishing characteristics that separated genuine Stradivarius instruments from skilled forgeries. But it was a particular section of the journal that caused Miss Marple's breath to catch slightly. The pages detailed with meticulous precision the exact composition and manufacture of E-strings. The notes described the materials required, the techniques for twisting and binding, and the specific procedures necessary to create strings that would be virtually indistinguishable from instruments manufactured 3 centuries prior. "She's been preparing this for considerable time," Miss Marple murmured, turning the pages with careful attention. The strings used to murder Mr. Ashworth were not merely weapons employed in a moment of passion. They were created with deliberation and purpose. This represents a woman who has transformed her suffering into a carefully orchestrated plan for vengeance. Inspector Carmichael was examining a locked box that had been stored beneath the flat's floorboards. He forced it open to reveal certificates, documents, and records related to the sale of instruments. Among them was the paperwork for the Stradivarius that Isabel Marchant had purchased 3 years previously from Stephen Ashworth. The certificate of authenticity bore Ashworth's signature and his personal seal, guaranteeing the instrument to be a genuine Stradivarius dating from 1712. "This is the instrument that was exposed as a forgery during her performance," Inspector Carmichael said grimly. "And here, Ashworth's own documentation certifying its authenticity. The question now becomes whether Ashworth was aware that he was perpetrating a fraud, or whether he was himself the victim of a more elaborate deception." Miss Marple held the certificate up to the light, examining it with the scrutiny of someone accustomed to perceiving subtleties that others might overlook. "I suspect we shall find that Mr. Ashworth was considerably more aware of his deceptions than one might initially assume. But to understand the full scope of this mystery, I believe we must examine the workshop where the forgeries were created. And to do that, Inspector, we must investigate the sources of the materials Mr. Ashworth employed." Chapter 3. The Demolished Churches and the Sanctified Wood. The investigation into Stephen Ashworth's operations revealed, over the course of several days, a far more elaborate conspiracy than Inspector Carmichael had initially anticipated. Ashworth's records, when finally decoded and examined by specialists in wooden construction and instrument manufacture, disclosed a systematic pattern of acquiring materials from sources that would prove deeply disturbing to those who understood their significance. The wood used in the forgeries came, it appeared, from demolished Italian churches, structures that had been destroyed by warfare, age, or deliberate demolition throughout the 20th century. Documents discovered in Ashworth's safe indicated that he had cultivated relationships with salvage dealers throughout Italy, men who specialized in recovering materials from destroyed religious structures. These salvage dealers would provide him with wood from ancient church timbers, pieces that carried within their grain the passage of centuries and indeed the very substance of sanctified spaces. This discovery troubled Miss Marple considerably. She sat in Inspector Carmichael's office contemplating the implications of this revelation with the kind of profound sadness that great moral transgressions inspired in her. To use materials salvaged from destroyed churches, she said slowly, to transform sacred wood into instruments of deception, represents a particularly acute form of desecration. It suggests not merely commercial fraud, but a conscious corruption of what many would consider holy. The inspector nodded grimly. We have traced at least 3 Italian dealers who provided wood to Ashworth over the course of nearly 15 years. Each piece was carefully selected for its age, its colour, its ability to closely resemble the specifications of wood that would have been available in Cremona during the 18th century. The forging was technically superb. Some of these instruments could have deceived even expert authenticators, given that Ashworth's certificates provided the appearance of legitimacy. And the certificates, Miss Marple inquired, how were they created? Surely their forgery required specialised knowledge. We discovered a skilled document forger, one Marcus Gellert, operating from a studio in Bethnal Green. Gellert has admitted to creating certificates for Ashworth for a period of 12 years. He claims that Ashworth paid exceptionally well for his work, and that Gellert himself was uncertain regarding the legitimacy of the instruments being certified. It is an excuse that carries little weight, given Gellert's obvious complicity. Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved toward the window of Carmichael's office, where she could observe the autumn London traffic flowing past with the mindless persistence of all ordinary life. The difficulty, Inspector, lies in understanding precisely how Isabel Marchant learned the full extent of Ashworth's deceptions. One might assume that discovering her own instrument to be counterfeit would be sufficient motivation for revenge, but the precision of her planning, the care with which she created the murder weapon, suggests knowledge that went far beyond personal injury. It was then that Inspector Carmichael received word that a significant development had occurred in the investigation. A man had come forward, claiming to possess knowledge of Ashworth's operations and expressing a willingness to provide evidence in exchange for consideration regarding his own potential criminal liability. The man's name was Peter Harrington, and he had been employed by Ashworth as a carpenter and instrument assembler for the past 7 years. Harrington's testimony provided, piece by piece, the final elements of the puzzle that had begun to form in Miss Marple's mind. He described in detailed terms how instruments were selected from legitimate makers in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, instruments of good quality but modest reputation. These instruments would be acquired at relatively low cost, then systematically altered to resemble Stradivarius violins of exceptional age and quality. The wood would be carefully selected from the Italian salvage dealers, the varnish would be artificially aged through chemical processes, and the internal structures would be modified to match the documented specifications of authentic 18th century instruments. Once these modifications were complete, Ashworth would submit the instruments to Gellert, who would create certificates attesting to their authenticity. Harrington had never personally encountered any resistance to this process from Ashworth himself. The man had seemed to view the entire operation as simply another form of business, morally equivalent to any other commercial endeavour. But there is something else, Harrington said, hesitantly, during his final interview with Miss Marple and Inspector Carmichael. Something that happened approximately a year ago. Ashworth received a visitor to his workshop, a woman who claimed to be a musicologist interested in examining his inventory. The woman spent several hours examining instruments, asking detailed questions about their origins, their construction, their authentication. Ashworth became increasingly uneasy during the visit. After the woman had departed, he spent the entire night examining his records and cross-referencing them against his sales history. He discovered something, Miss Marple said with certainty. Something that disturbed him greatly. Harrington nodded. He realized that one of the instruments he had sold under his certificate of authenticity had been exposed as fraudulent during a live performance. He attempted to contact the purchaser to attempt some form of restitution or renegotiation, but by that time the woman's career had already collapsed. He seemed genuinely troubled by the discovery. Not because of the damage to his reputation, though that concerned him, but because the woman involved had apparently lost everything. And this woman, Miss Marple asked gently, did Ashworth identify her by name? He did eventually, through consultation with music critics and concert reviews. Her name was Isabel Marchant, and when he understood what had occurred, he attempted to contact her personally. He wrote letters expressing regret, offering financial recompense, suggesting that the entire matter had been a tragic mistake, rather than a deliberate deception on his part. Letters, Miss Marple repeated. Letters that Isabel Marchant received and presumably read. According to Harrington, Ashworth received no responses to these letters. But I suspect, Harrington said carefully, that Miss Marchant read them nonetheless. And I suspect that the act of attempting to provide monetary compensation for the destruction of her life only deepened her sense of betrayal and her desire for vengeance. Chapter 4. The Fingerprints of Fury. The search for Isabel Marchant extended across a 3-county area, with Inspector Carmichael coordinating police efforts in London, Kent, Sussex and Surrey. Miss Marple provided detailed observations regarding the likely patterns of behaviour that Marchant would exhibit given her particular circumstances and psychology. The woman, she suggested, would not flee to the continent or attempt to disappear into anonymity. Rather, she would remain close to the scenes of her humiliation and suffering, observing the consequences of her actions with a grim satisfaction. 2 weeks after Stephen Ashworth's death, Isabel Marchant was found residing in a small boarding house in Dulwich, under the assumed name of Margaret Sterling. She had been living a quiet, reclusive existence, working part-time as a music teacher for private students, and spending her evenings playing the Prague-made violin that had become her sole companion and confidant. When Inspector Carmichael and Miss Marple arrived at the boarding house, they found Marchant in her room, sitting at the window with the violin held loosely across her lap. She did not attempt to flee or resist arrest. Instead, she turned to face the inspector with an expression of profound resignation, as though she had been expecting this moment for an extended period. "You understand, then," she said quietly. "You understand what he did to me, and why he required punishment." Miss Marple entered the room with careful deliberation, positioning herself where she could observe Marchant's face clearly. "I understand that you suffered a devastating loss," she said gently. "I understand that your career was destroyed, your reputation shattered, and your future rendered utterly uncertain by the discovery that the instrument you had trusted was a fraudulent creation. But understanding suffering and condoning the taking of a life are not equivalent actions." Isabel Marchant's face twisted with the intensity of emotions that had apparently been suppressed for an extended period. "You cannot possibly understand," the woman said with fierce intensity. "To spend years developing a skill, to sacrifice personal relationships and ordinary happiness in pursuit of artistic excellence, to reach the very pinnacle of one's profession, and then to have it all revealed as having been built upon a lie. He sold me a lie, Miss Marple. He certified the authenticity of a forgery and assured me that I was purchasing an instrument of unparalleled greatness." "I do not argue against the validity of your suffering," Miss Marple replied. "But tell me, what became of that suffering when you killed Mr. Ashworth? Did the taking of his life restore your career? Did it return to you the opportunities that were lost?" Marchant's eyes filled with tears. "No," she whispered, "it restored nothing. But it ensured that he would not continue to deceive others, that his deceptions would be exposed, that his reputation would be destroyed as mine was destroyed. He did not deserve to live in comfort while I lived in exile from everything that gave my life meaning." Miss Marple settled herself in a chair beside the window. "I believe, Miss Marchant, that I understand the mechanisms by which your justifications operated. You transformed his death from an act of personal revenge into an act of justice. You convinced yourself that in eliminating him, you were protecting future victims of his fraud. But revenge dressed in the clothing of justice remains revenge nonetheless." Isabel Marchant's resistance seemed to collapse at this moment. She set the violin aside with a gesture of finality and held out her wrists toward Inspector Carmichael. "I created the strings myself," she said, her voice now barely above a whisper. I studied violin manufacture obsessively, learning every technique, every material, every process. I forged the maker's mark with perfect precision. I wanted the strings themselves to be beautiful, to be worthy of the purpose they would serve. And when I was satisfied with my creation, I went to his shop one evening, disguised my appearance, and I waited for him to be alone. "What occurred then?" Miss Marple asked gently. I went to him ostensibly to inquire about selling him some old documents related to violin manufacture. He was eager to examine them, distracted by the promise of potential profit. I approached him from behind while he was examining the papers, and I was able to place the strings around his neck before he fully understood what was occurring. The struggle was brief. His body was not strong, and his surprise prevented him from mounting adequate resistance. Within minutes, it was finished, and the search of his office, the disorder we observed. I was seeking documentation of his deceptions, evidence that would prove the extent of his fraud when his body was discovered. I found his records, his correspondence with the salvage dealers in Italy, his agreements with the document forger. I scattered some of these throughout the office to ensure they would be discovered, but I also concealed others in a safe location, intending to ensure that the truth would eventually emerge. Miss Marple observed Marchant with the characteristic mixture of sadness and comprehension that great human suffering inspired in her. You anticipated that his death would be investigated, that the circumstances would become public, that the full extent of his deceptions would be exposed. You were willing to sacrifice your own freedom to ensure that his fraud became impossible to ignore or conceal. "Yes," Isabel said simply, "and I regret nothing except that no amount of justice can restore to me what was lost. The years I cannot recover, the performances I will never give, the career that will never be rebuilt. These are the losses that must endure beyond his death." Chapter 5. The Forger's Admission. While Isabel Marchant remained in custody awaiting formal charges, the investigation continued its examination of the broader conspiracy that had sustained Ashworth's fraudulent operations for more than a decade. Marcus Gellert, the document forger, agreed to cooperate fully with police inquiries in exchange for consideration regarding his own culpability. His testimony provided considerable illumination regarding the financial scope of Ashworth's enterprise and the elaborate mechanisms by which deception had been sustained. Gellert revealed that Ashworth's annual revenue from the sale of forged instruments had exceeded £3 million in several recent years. The profit margins were extraordinary, particularly given that the actual costs of materials and labour rarely exceeded 20% of the selling price. Wealthy collectors, orchestral institutions, and concert musicians had acquired instruments that they believed to be genuine Stradivarius violins worth between £1.5 and £3 million, when in fact their actual value rarely exceeded £100,000. The scale of this fraud was extraordinary, Inspector Carmichael observed to Miss Marple as they examined the documentation of Ashworth's sales over the past 15 years. How is it possible that such deception could be sustained across so many transactions and across so many supposedly expert evaluators? Miss Marple reviewed the files with the meticulous attention she habitually applied to complex patterns of human behavior. "The answer," she said thoughtfully, "lies in the power of reputation and the reluctance of individuals to acknowledge that they might have been deceived. Ashworth cultivated an image of impeccable authenticity. His evaluations were sought by museums and major institutions. Once such reputation became established, it created a kind of protective shield that prevented scrutiny. When someone had paid an enormous sum for an instrument that Ashworth had certified, they had considerable motivation to accept his evaluation rather than to question it. Moreover, Miss Marple continued, the very nature of violin authentication creates substantial room for subjective interpretation. There is no simple physical test that can definitively establish a violin's origin. Authentication depends upon knowledge, judgment, experience, and intuition. Ashworth had all of these, along with considerable skill in the manipulation of perceptual bias. When he presented an instrument to a potential purchaser and assured them of its authenticity, he was not merely providing a certificate. He was leveraging his established reputation to create an atmosphere of confidence and certainty. "What of the salvage dealers in Italy?" Miss Marple inquired. How did Ashworth identify them and establish relationships with them? Gellert provided considerable detail regarding this aspect of the operation. Ashworth had initially discovered that wood from older buildings possessed characteristics that closely resembled the wood used in authentic Stradivarius violins. He subsequently travelled extensively throughout Italy, visiting regions that had been damaged by warfare or urban development. He cultivated relationships with demolition contractors and salvage specialists, eventually establishing a network of dealers who understood his requirements and would set aside appropriate materials for his use. The Italian dealers, Gellert explained, charged Ashworth relatively modest sums for the wood, typically between £500 and £2,000 per shipment. They were satisfied with these prices, not understanding the ultimate use to which the materials would be put. Had they known that their salvaged church timber would be fashioned into fraudulent instruments, many of them would have been deeply disturbed. Some were driven by straightforward profit motive, but others, Gellert suggested, were motivated by a kind of romantic notion that ancient wood should be preserved and utilised rather than left to deteriorate in demolition sites. This detail touched something within Miss Marple that she did not immediately articulate. The use of materials from demolished churches as the foundation for fraud represented, in her view, a particular species of blasphemy. The wood had possessed a certain sanctity, a connection to centuries of human devotion and spiritual aspiration. By transforming these materials into the vehicle of deception, Ashworth had not merely committed commercial fraud, he had, in a sense, corrupted something sacred. As the investigation progressed, additional aspects of Ashworth's operation came to light. He had maintained careful financial records, investing his fraudulent profits in legitimate business enterprises, purchasing property, and gradually acquiring the appearance of a man of substantial inherited wealth. His personal life had been remarkably unremarkable, marked by the absence of close relationships or significant emotional connections. He lived alone in a tastefully furnished flat in Knightsbridge, attended the opera occasionally, and maintained membership in several exclusive clubs. To all external appearances, he was a respectable gentleman of refined taste and considerable resources. Yet beneath this facade lay a man of profound moral corruption, one who had carefully calculated the financial benefits of deception and determined that the risks were acceptable. He had presumably rationalized his actions through some complex mental process that allowed him to view violin fraud as essentially equivalent to any other form of business maneuvering. That such deceptions might destroy lives, careers, and artistic futures had apparently not penetrated his consciousness or his conscience. It was this particular aspect of Ashworth's psychology that Miss Marple found herself contemplating with considerable intensity. She shared her observations with Inspector Carmichael as they reviewed the final elements of evidence that would be presented during the formal investigation and subsequent trial. "What interests me most," Miss Marple said, "is not how Ashworth committed his fraud, but why he seemed to believe he could do so without moral consequence. He had possessed opportunities, I suspect, to modify his behaviour when the evidence of Isabel Marchant's suffering became apparent. His correspondence with her, the attempts at financial recompense, suggest that he experienced at least a momentary awareness of the harm he had caused. Yet this awareness did not translate into genuine change or significant alteration of his practices. Perhaps, Carmichael suggested, he had become so accustomed to deception that he could no longer distinguish between legitimate and fraudulent practices. Perhaps his moral faculties had simply atrophied through disuse and rationalization. "That is indeed possible," Miss Marple agreed, "but I suspect there was an additional element at work. Ashworth may have convinced himself that his actions, though fraudulent in technical terms, were ultimately acceptable because they satisfied market demand. People wanted to believe they had purchased Stradivarius violins. They were willing to pay enormous sums for the opportunity to possess instruments that would connect them to centuries of musical history. Perhaps Ashworth viewed himself as a kind of impresario of dreams, providing purchasers with the experience of authenticity rather than authenticity itself. Whatever the case, Miss Marple concluded, the consequences of his moral failure have become inescapable. Isabel Marchant has chosen to bear those consequences through an act that will itself result in considerable suffering. The wheels of justice will now turn, and both perpetrator and victim of fraud will face the legal consequences of their actions. Chapter 6. The Authentication of Sorrow. As the formal investigation proceeded toward conclusion and charges were prepared against both Isabel Marchant and the various co-conspirators in Ashworth's fraudulent operations, Miss Marple found herself returning to the Chelsea Gallery for a final examination of the crime scene. The shop had been closed since the discovery of Ashworth's body, its elegant window now bare and displaying only the faint impression of where the single Stradivarius violin had rested upon its velvet cushion. Inspector Carmichael accompanied her on this final visit, carrying with him the complete dossier of evidence that had been assembled. The back room where Ashworth had been discovered lay undisturbed, preserved exactly as it had been found, awaiting only the formal conclusion of the investigation before being released for cleaning and restoration. Miss Marple positioned herself in the centre of the room, her eyes moving slowly across every detail of the space. The location itself was significant, she observed, not in the front room where the display instruments rested, but here in the private office where the true work of deception occurred. This was the room where certificates were signed, where deals were conducted, where the mechanisms of fraud were established and maintained. Ashworth spent considerable time in this room, I suspect, Inspector Carmichael said. His assistant would have managed much of the front shop business, while Ashworth focused his attention on the more complex dealings with collectors and institutions. He did not hide his deceptions, Miss Marple observed, or rather, he hid them in plain view, protected by the authority of his reputation and the general reluctance of individuals to question those they had chosen to trust. His clients would not have been ordinary people, Inspector. They would have been individuals of considerable means, individuals accustomed to obtaining what they desired through financial means. The inspector consulted his records. The purchasers ranged from wealthy private collectors to major orchestral institutions. Several instruments were sold to well-known concert musicians, individuals whose careers were built upon the assumption that they were performing upon authentic, historical instruments of exceptional value, and when these instruments were later exposed as fraudulent, Miss Marple asked, what became of the musicians who had performed upon them? What psychological damage resulted from the discovery that their professional accomplishments had been, in a sense, falsified by the instruments themselves? In the cases I have examined, Carmichael said grimly, the consequences ranged from mere embarrassment to considerable professional damage. Several musicians ceased performing and withdrew from public life. A few attempted to rebuild their careers, but found that the stain of association with forged instruments was difficult to overcome. And in Marchant's case, the exposure was so public and so devastating that she was effectively exiled from the musical profession. It is for this reason that her decision to murder Ashworth carries a kind of tragic logic, Miss Marple said quietly. She did not kill him in a moment of passion or impulsive rage. She killed him as a calculated act of justice, as a means of ensuring that his fraud would be exposed and his reputation destroyed. In destroying him, she sought to create a public acknowledgement of what had been done to her and to others like her. The inspector was silent for a moment, contemplating the implications of this observation. Do you believe, Miss Marple, that Marchant acted in a manner that was morally justified? Miss Marple turned to face him directly, her aged eyes clear and penetrating. I believe that Marchant acted in a manner that was profoundly human, Inspector. She was wounded, betrayed, and abandoned by a society that initially lauded her and subsequently rejected her when the foundation of her success was revealed to be false. The desire for vengeance arose from that wound as naturally as a water flows downhill. But I do not believe that murder represents a justified response, however understandable the impulse might be. The law, Miss Marple continued, exists, precisely because individuals cannot be trusted to administer justice on their own behalf. We are all too likely to rationalize our own actions, to view our own suffering as justifying behavior we would condemn in others. Marchant's murder of Ashworth will result in her own incarceration and the continuation of her suffering through different means. She has not freed herself from the consequences of Ashworth's fraud. She has merely transformed those consequences into something even more devastating. As if in response to this observation, a young man appeared in the doorway of the back room. He was introduced to Miss Marple and Inspector Carmichael as Thomas Ashworth, the victim's nephew and sole heir to his considerable estate. The young man had come to examine the shop that he would now inherit, though he carried himself with the reluctance of someone inheriting something tainted by moral corruption. "I have struggled considerably with my relationship to my uncle's legacy," Thomas said, after introducing himself. I knew that he dealt in valuable instruments, of course. I did not know the full extent of his deceptions until the investigation revealed the scope of his fraud. The family is considerably embarrassed by his actions. "That is understandable," Miss Marple said gently. "Yet I wonder whether you and your family might consider what responsibility you bear for how this legacy should be addressed. You have inherited substantial financial resources that were derived from fraudulent transactions. You might consider whether those resources should be utilized in making restitution to those who were harmed by your uncle's deceptions." Thomas Ashworth's expression shifted slightly, as though he had not previously considered this possibility. "I have not thought to consider it in those terms," he said slowly. "But you are suggesting that I might use my inheritance to provide financial compensation to the victims of my uncle's fraud." "I am suggesting," Miss Marple replied, "that such an action would represent a form of moral reclamation. You were not responsible for your uncle's deceptions, yet you have benefited from them. You might consider whether accepting that benefit without attempting to address the harm from which it derived represents a form of complicity, albeit passive complicity." Chapter 7. The Stradivarius That Sang of Truth. In the weeks that followed the arrest and formal charging of both Isabel Marchant and the co-conspirators in Ashworth's fraudulent enterprise, Miss Marple maintained a continuing interest in the broader implications of the case. The newspapers carried extensive coverage of the scandal, focusing particular attention on the musicians and institutions that had been deceived into accepting forged instruments as authentic masterpieces. One such case involved the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, which had proudly displayed a Stradivarius violin as part of their institutional collection, believing it to be an acquisition of genuine historical significance. The discovery that the instrument was a forgery created considerable embarrassment for the orchestra, and they initiated their own internal investigation to determine how such deception could have been sustained. It was during this period that Miss Marple received a visitor at her flat near Knightsbridge. The visitor was Helena Pierce, the orchestra's principal investigator, a woman of approximately 50 years, with the methodical demeanour of one accustomed to examining evidence with meticulous care. "Miss Marple," Helena began, after the customary pleasantries had been observed, "I have been asked by the orchestra's board of directors to examine our instrument collection and to determine how many additional items might be fraudulent. The task is proving considerably more difficult than anticipated." "That is understandable," Miss Marple replied, offering tea. "Violin authentication has always been more art than science. Ashworth exploited that ambiguity deliberately, creating instruments that were technically excellent, while simultaneously falsifying their provenance and history." "What troubles me most," Helena said, "is the realization that the musicians have been performing upon these forged instruments for years without any awareness of their true nature. Yet the music they produced was beautiful and moving. The fraud did not alter the acoustic properties of the instruments in any meaningful way, and yet it altered everything about how we understood their performances." "This observation strikes me as philosophically profound," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "You are suggesting that the value and significance of a work of art lies partially in its authenticity, in the belief that it is what we think it to be. When that belief is undermined, the value itself becomes questionable, even if the object remains materially unchanged." "Precisely," Helena agreed. "And this raises questions that I have not yet been able to answer satisfactorily. If a musician performs beautifully upon an instrument that they believe to be a Stradivarius, is their performance rendered inferior when it is later discovered that the instrument was a forgery? Did the beauty of the music depend in any way upon the instrument's authenticity?" Miss Marple considered this question with the careful deliberation she applied to all philosophical inquiries. "I suspect that the answer varies depending upon the individual listener and their relationship to concepts of authenticity and value. For some, The knowledge that an instrument was fraudulent would taint their perception of the music itself. For others, the music would retain its inherent beauty regardless of the instrument's provenance. The situation represents a fascinating intersection of commerce, artistry, and moral philosophy, Miss Marple continued. Your musicians created beauty using tools they believed to be authentic. That beauty was nonetheless real, regardless of the tools' actual origins. Yet the fraud that was perpetrated upon them and upon your institution cannot be separated from the aesthetic experience of listening to their performances. Perhaps, Helena suggested slowly, the real tragedy is not that they performed upon forged instruments, but that they did not know they were forged. They were robbed of the opportunity to make an informed choice about whether they wished to participate in the perpetuation of deception, even unknowing deception. That is an important distinction, Miss Marple agreed, and it addresses a deeper principle regarding the importance of consent and knowledge in ethical relationships. You have correctly identified the core violation that Ashworth perpetrated. He took from his clients the information necessary to make informed choices about their acquisitions. As Helena departed, Miss Marple found herself returning to contemplation of the themes that the case had raised. The question of authenticity, she reflected, extended far beyond violin manufacture. It spoke to fundamental human yearnings for connection to the past, for ownership of objects that possessed historical significance and material substance. Ashworth had exploited these yearnings, providing his clients with the psychological satisfaction of possessing something ancient and valuable while depriving them of the actual substance of authenticity. In a sense, Miss Marple mused, all deception operates according to similar principles. The perpetrator provides the victim with a false sense of security, confidence or satisfaction, while systematically concealing the truth that would undermine these feelings. And the longer the deception persists, the more invested the victim becomes in maintaining their belief in the lie. Chapter 8. The Courtroom and the Judgment. The trial of Isabel Marchant proceeded through the autumn months with considerable public attention. The case had captured the imagination of the media and the general public, who viewed it as a dramatic confrontation between artistic integrity and commercial fraud. Newspaper accounts presented Marchant as a tragic figure, a talented musician whose career had been destroyed by Ashworth's deceptions, and who had responded to that destruction through an act of violence born of desperation and moral outrage. The trial's progress revealed a complex legal and ethical terrain. Marchant's defense counsel argued that while she had indeed committed the act of murder, her actions had been motivated by legitimate grievances and a reasonable belief that the legal system had failed to address Ashworth's systematic deception of musicians and institutions. They argued for a conviction on a reduced charge of manslaughter rather than murder, contending that Marchant's mental state had been significantly compromised by the trauma of her career's destruction. The prosecution countered with evidence of the calculated nature of Marchant's preparations, the deliberate creation of the murder weapon using specialized knowledge of violin string manufacture, and the systematic execution of her plan to murder Ashworth and frame her actions as an act of justice. They presented Marchant as a cold and calculating individual whose desire for revenge had overridden any consideration for the life of her victim. Miss Marple attended several sessions of the trial, observing the proceedings with the careful attention she had always given to complex human dramas. She noted how Marchant conducted herself in the dock with a kind of defiant dignity, neither attempting to deny her actions nor to offer excuses or apologies. She seemed to view the trial as an opportunity to publicly expose the extent of Ashworth's fraud, and to ensure that the damage he had caused was understood and acknowledged. The judge, Lord Justice Hartley, was a man of approximately 70 years, with a reputation for intelligence and fair-mindedness. His summing up of the case carefully traced the legal principles involved and addressed the question of whether Marchant's personal suffering could be said to justify or mitigate the severity of her crime. The law, Lord Justice Hartley instructed the jury, recognizes no principle by which personal grievance, however legitimate, justifies the taking of another's life. If such a principle were to be accepted, We would reduce the law to chaos, as each individual would become the arbiter of justice according to their own perception of wrongdoing. The legal system exists precisely to prevent the substitution of personal vengeance for measured justice. That being said, the judge continued, the jury may consider Marchant's personal circumstances in determining whether the offence constitutes murder or the lesser charge of manslaughter. Manslaughter may be charged in circumstances where the defendant has committed a homicide while under such mental and emotional disturbance that their capacity for rational judgment was significantly compromised. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning with a verdict of guilty of manslaughter, rejecting the prosecution's charge of murder. In pronouncing sentence, Lord Justice Hartley acknowledged both the gravity of Marchant's crime and the legitimacy of her suffering, sentencing her to 12 years' imprisonment. The sentence represented a significant reduction from the life imprisonment that would have been mandatory upon conviction for murder, yet it nonetheless represented a substantial period of incarceration. As Miss Marple observed Marchant being led from the dock following the pronouncement of sentence, she noted the expression on the woman's face. It carried neither triumph nor despair, but rather a kind of acceptance, as though Marchant had anticipated this conclusion and had prepared herself for it emotionally and psychologically. Outside the courtroom, Miss Marple spoke briefly with Inspector Carmichael regarding the case's conclusion. Justice has been served, the inspector observed, though neither the law nor the sentence has restored to Marchant what she has lost. That is indeed the fundamental limitation of all legal justice, Miss Marple replied. The law cannot restore what has been destroyed. It can only prevent future destruction through the incapacitation or deterrence of wrongdoers. In Marchant's case, the legal system has addressed her crime, but the underlying tragedy that motivated her actions remains unresolved. What do you mean specifically? The inspector inquired. I mean, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, that the destruction of Marchant's career and the failure of the legal system to address Ashworth's fraud in a timely manner represent failures of justice that precede and motivate her act of violence. The trial has focused appropriately on her criminal conduct, but it has not addressed the broader failure of authority to prevent the deceptions that caused her suffering. Chapter 9. The Restitution and the Reckoning. In the months following Marchant's conviction and sentencing, the ramifications of the scandal continued to unfold across the musical and collecting communities. Thomas Ashworth, acting upon Miss Marple's suggestion, initiated a restitution program designed to provide financial compensation to the musicians and institutions that had been defrauded through his uncle's fraudulent operations. The process proved considerably more complex than one might initially have anticipated. Many of the victims expressed reluctance to accept financial compensation, viewing such compensation as an inadequate response to the damage that had been done to their reputations and careers. Others seized upon the opportunity to recoup their financial losses, viewing the restitution as partial justice for the deceptions they had endured. Miss Marple served informally as a consulting advisor to Thomas regarding the implementation of the restitution program, helping to identify victims and determine appropriate levels of compensation. This work brought her into contact with numerous musicians whose careers had been affected by Ashworth's fraud, and through these interactions she gained a deeper understanding of the profound psychological impact that such deceptions could inflict. One particular case affected her considerably. A young violinist named Catherine Morrison had performed extensively upon what she believed to be a Stradivarius violin, one that had been certified by Ashworth as genuine. Her career had been ascending toward considerable prominence when the exposure of the instrument as fraudulent occurred during a live broadcast concert. The humiliation of this public revelation, combined with the sudden withdrawal of concert offers and recording contracts, had caused her to abandon her musical career entirely. Miss Marple requested a meeting with Catherine, which was arranged at a small cafe near the Royal College of Music. The young woman appeared considerably older than her stated age of 28, her face bearing the particular strain of someone who had experienced significant trauma and had not yet fully recovered from it. I have received the financial compensation that Mr. Ashworth has offered, Catherine said, after the preliminaries of their conversation had been completed, and I am grateful for the gesture. but there is no amount of money that can restore to me the career that I have lost. The opportunities that were available to me have passed to others. The confidence that I once had in my abilities has been replaced by doubt and uncertainty." "That is understandable," Miss Marple said, with characteristic gentleness. "And I suspect that your loss represents the kind of damage that extends far beyond financial calculation. You have lost not merely income or professional opportunity, but identity itself. Your career was central to your sense of self." Catherine nodded, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I cannot listen to music anymore, without a kind of bitterness. The pieces that I loved are now tainted by the knowledge that my interpretations of them were based upon a lie. Every accomplishment that I achieved feels hollow because it was accomplished upon a fraudulent instrument." "Yet the music you created was not fraudulent," Miss Marple observed gently. "Your skill and artistry were genuine. The instrument upon which you performed was fraudulent, but your contribution to the music itself was authentic." Catherine looked sceptical. "But does that truly matter? The critics and the audience believed that my performances were enhanced by the presence of an authentic Stradivarius. Without that belief, would my performances have been received with such acclaim? I cannot be certain of my own worth in relation to the music, because I cannot separate my performance from the instrument upon which it was created." This observation struck Miss Marple as representing a particularly acute form of psychological injury. The victim had not merely been defrauded financially or professionally. They had been robbed of the ability to trust their own achievements and to have confidence in their own capabilities. The fraud had penetrated into the deepest levels of self-understanding and self-evaluation. "I believe," Miss Marple said after a period of careful consideration, "that you might benefit from rebuilding your relationship to music, not as a professional pursuit, but as a personal one. Begin by playing music upon an ordinary violin, one that you know to be what it claims to be. Perform for yourself rather than for an audience. Rediscover the joy and satisfaction that music can bring, apart from questions of authenticity or certification. In doing so, you may be able to begin rebuilding the confidence in your own abilities that this fraudster has attempted to destroy." Catherine appeared sceptical but thoughtful. "You believe that I might eventually return to professional performance?" "I believe that you might eventually choose whether to return to professional performance," Miss Marple replied. "And that choice, made freely and with full knowledge of your own capabilities and limitations, would be far more valuable than any amount of forced rehabilitation. Trust yourself. Begin with music that you love, played upon an instrument that you understand, for an audience that consists only of yourself. The rest will follow as it may." Chapter 10. The Final Melody and the Echo of Truth. The investigation into Stephen Ashworth's fraudulent operations continued for several additional months, as police authorities worked to identify the full extent of his deceptions and to locate all individuals and institutions that had been harmed by his actions. The scope of the fraud proved to be even more extensive than initial investigations had suggested. At the time of his death, Ashworth had active sales negotiations with collectors in multiple countries, and documents discovered in his possession indicated that he had been contemplating the expansion of his fraudulent operations into the forging of other stringed instruments, including cellos and violas. Inspector Carmichael made a final visit to Miss Marple in the spring following the conclusion of Marchant's trial. The inspector appeared considerably more relaxed than he had during the height of the investigation, as though the closure of the case had allowed him to release tension that he had carried for an extended period. "The case has effectively concluded," he reported. "Ashworth's various accomplices have been prosecuted. Marcus Gellert, the document forger, has received a sentence of 5 years imprisonment. Peter Harrington, the instrument assembler, received a sentence of 3 years, substantially reduced due to his cooperation with the investigation. The Italian salvage dealers have not been prosecuted, as their knowledge of the deceptions was limited and they were technically guilty of no crime under Italian law." "And Isabel Marchant," Miss Marple inquired, "how is she adjusting to her imprisonment?" "From what I have learned, she has become something of a notable figure within the prison system. She has established a music program, teaching other inmates musical theory and providing instruction on various instruments. Her behavior has been exemplary, and she has expressed no regret regarding her actions, though she has also not attempted to repeat them or to advocate for violence as a form of justice. That seems appropriate given her circumstances, Miss Marple observed. She has been given an opportunity to transform her suffering into something that might benefit others. That is perhaps the only form of redemption that is available to her. Inspector Carmichael prepared to depart, but paused at the threshold of Miss Marple's sitting room. "I have often wondered," he said thoughtfully, "whether you believe that justice has truly been served in this case. Ashworth is dead, murdered by a woman whose career he destroyed. Marchant is imprisoned, her life effectively ended by her own hand, as surely as if she had taken her own life rather than his. The musical community continues to struggle with the implications of having been deceived on such a large scale. Who, in the end, has truly benefited from any of this?" Miss Marple considered the question with the gravity it deserved. "I believe, Inspector, that justice has been served in the sense that the truth has been revealed, and those responsible for deception have been held accountable. But you are correct in noting that no one has truly benefited from the sequence of events that this case has encompassed. There are only losses, upon losses, upon losses. The only measure of benefit lies in the possibility that the exposure of this fraud will make future frauds more difficult to perpetrate, and that other defrauded victims might recognize their situation more quickly and seek legal remedies rather than attempting to secure their own revenge." As the inspector departed, Miss Marple settled herself by the window of her sitting room, where she could observe the spring afternoon gradually yielding to evening. She reflected upon the melancholy progression of events that had culminated in the death of Stephen Ashworth and the imprisonment of Isabel Marchant. The greatest tragedy, she mused, was perhaps not the fraud itself or the murder that had followed, but rather the existence of a system of accountability so inadequate that individuals felt compelled to abandon the law and take justice into their own hands. Marchant had not murdered Ashworth out of malice or base desire for revenge alone. She had murdered him because she had lost faith in the capacity of the legal system to address the wrongs that had been committed against her and others like her. Several weeks after Inspector Carmichael's final visit, Miss Marple received a communication from Catherine Morrison. The young violinist had taken Miss Marple's suggestion to heart and had begun performing music for her own enjoyment. She reported that the experience had indeed been restorative, allowing her to rediscover the joy that had originally motivated her to pursue music as a career. More significantly, Catherine indicated that she was considering a gradual return to professional performance, not as a concert violinist, performing upon celebrated instruments before large audiences, but as a music teacher, passing on her knowledge and experience to a new generation of students. She had begun teaching at a music academy in East London, working with students who came from disadvantaged backgrounds and who might not otherwise have access to high-quality musical instruction. The final letter that Miss Marple received was from Isabel Marchant herself, written from her prison cell. The letter expressed no request for forgiveness and no regret regarding her actions, but it did express a kind of reconciliation with her circumstances. Marchant wrote of the satisfaction she had found in teaching music to other inmates, in witnessing the transformation that artistic expression could bring to individuals who had experienced trauma and loss. She suggested that in providing this service she had found a purpose that gave her imprisoned existence a measure of meaning. These developments, Miss Marple reflected, represented something approximating redemption, though it was a redemption that had been purchased at an extraordinary price. Both women, defrauded and deceived by Stephen Ashworth and the system that had enabled his deceptions, had eventually found ways to channel their suffering into benefit for others. As the summer advanced and the case gradually faded from public consciousness, Miss Marple found herself occasionally reflecting upon the questions that the Stradivarius violin Strangling had raised. Questions about authenticity, deception, justice, and the proper response to moral betrayal. She had no definitive answers to these questions, but she had arrived at a deeper understanding of the complexity of human motivation and the ways in which trauma and loss could transform individuals in both destructive and restorative directions. The violin that Isabel Marchant had played, the Prague-made instrument that had been her sole companion through her years of exile and suffering, had eventually been acquired by Catherine Morrison. Marchant had arranged for its transfer to the younger woman through her legal representative, along with a note suggesting that Catherine might find value in an instrument that was honest in its claims and authentic in its construction. Catherine had accepted this gift and had incorporated the violin into her teaching, using it to demonstrate to her students the principle that authenticity and honesty held value, independent of legendary reputation or celebrated history. And so, the Stradivarius violin Strangling, like so many complex human dramas, came to a conclusion that was neither entirely satisfying nor entirely tragic. Justice had been served, though imperfectly. Truths had been revealed, though at considerable cost. And from the ashes of deception and destruction, something approximating healing and reconciliation had begun to emerge. Miss Marple, reflecting upon the case in her later years, would remember it as one of the most challenging and morally complex mysteries that she had encountered. It had taught her much about the nature of deception, the damage that could result from the violation of trust, and the profound human need to believe in the authenticity and integrity of the things upon which we build our lives and our identities. And it had reminded her once again that in the pursuit of justice, one must always remember that the victims of fraud and deception are not merely the recipients of false information, but human beings whose entire sense of self and purpose can be destroyed by the knowledge that their achievements were built upon a foundation of lies.